At 9:00 a.m., the day feels full of potential. By 6:00 p.m., it feels gone. The tabs are still open. The notes are half written. The task you meant to finish somehow never crossed the finish line. Not because nothing happened, but because everything happened at once. That strange gap between being busy and being effective is where this story begins. Most days don't fall apart dramatically. They dissolve, one interruption at a time. A quick check that turns into 10 minutes. A small task that pulls attention away just long enough to lose the thread. By the time focus tries to return, the moment has passed. The day keeps moving, but the work that actually matters stays untouched. For a long time, this has felt normal, even expected. Being reachable became more important than being focused. Fast responses replaced deep thinking. Activity became a stand-in for progress. And quietly, without anyone really noticing, the ability to stay with a hard problem for an extended period started to fade. Cal Newport gives that fading ability a name, and more importantly, he explains why it matters. The most valuable work today doesn't come from constant motion. It comes from sustained concentration, from long, uninterrupted stretches where the mind can finally settle into a problem and push past the obvious answers. He calls this deep work, and he argues that it's becoming rare at the exact moment it's becoming most valuable. This kind of work feels different. Time moves strangely. Distractions feel louder because they don't belong. There's resistance at the start, but once the mind locks in, something clicks. Ideas connect. Solutions appear that weren't visible before, not because of talent, but because attention stayed long enough to let them form. The problem isn't that people don't care about doing meaningful work. The problem is that modern life quietly trains the brain to avoid it. Every notification teaches the mind to seek novelty. Every quick hit of stimulation makes stillness feel uncomfortable. Over time, depth begins to feel heavy, even though it's where the best work lives. That's why Newport's first insight isn't about working harder, it's about working with intention. Deep work doesn't happen accidentally. It requires boundaries, a chosen time, a chosen place, a clear target. When focus becomes a ritual instead of a hope, it stops competing with everything else. But there's an uncomfortable truth beneath that idea. Focus requires tolerance for boredom. If every quiet moment is filled with scrolling, the mind loses its ability to stay put. Deep work demands mental endurance, the kind that only develops when the brain isn't constantly rescued from stillness. Then there's the digital noise. Not all of it is bad, but not all of it is necessary either. Every tool, platform, and feed comes with a hidden cost: attention. When something repeatedly interrupts thought without giving real value back, it quietly drains the energy needed for deeper thinking. And finally, there's the work that fills the day but leaves no trace. Emails, updates, meetings, small tasks that feel urgent but rarely important. Newport doesn't suggest eliminating them, he suggests containing them. When shallow work expands unchecked, it consumes the hours where deep work should live. What changes when even a small portion of the day is protected for real focus is subtle at first. Work feels heavier, not overwhelming but substantial. Progress becomes visible again. Not louder, not faster, just real. And that brings us back to the beginning. To that moment at the end of the day when the screen goes dark and the question quietly appears: what actually moved forward today? In a world designed to fragment attention, the ability to focus deeply isn't just a skill, it's a decision. And once that decision is made, the quality of everything else begins to change. That decision doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't feel dramatic. Most of the time, it looks small and almost insignificant, choosing to stay with a difficult paragraph instead of opening a new tab, choosing to sit with a problem a few minutes longer instead of moving on to something easier. But those moments add up. They quietly separate work that fades from work that lasts. Because deep work doesn't just change what gets done, it changes how the mind experiences effort. When attention stops being scattered, effort stops feeling exhausting. The same hour that once felt draining suddenly feels purposeful, not because the work became easier, but because it became clearer. Focus removes the friction that distraction creates. Over time, this shift compounds. Skills develop faster, thinking becomes sharper. Confidence grows, not from constant validation, but from the quiet knowledge that something difficult was handled well. In a culture obsessed with visibility, deep work builds value in private, and that value eventually shows up in public results. This is why deep work isn't a productivity trend. It's a survival skill. As automation increases and surface-level tasks become easier to replace, the ability to think deeply, learn quickly, and create at a high level becomes harder to ignore. Depth becomes the difference between being replaceable and being rare. And here's the part that often goes unsaid. Deep work isn't about withdrawing from the world. It's about choosing when to engage with it. When attention is controlled instead of constantly pulled, work gains weight and time gains shape. Days stop blurring together. Progress becomes something you can actually feel. So the next time the day begins with promise and ends in confusion, remember this: nothing is wrong with ambition or effort. What's missing is depth. And once depth returns, work stops feeling like noise and starts sounding like signal. Signal, unlike noise, has direction. It moves towards something. And when work has direction, motivation stops needing to be chased. It shows up naturally, pulled forward by clarity instead of pushed by pressure. That's the quiet power behind deep work. It aligns effort with purpose. This is why the most meaningful breakthroughs rarely happen in frantic moments. They happen in silence, in stretches of time where nothing competes for attention, and the mind is allowed to wrestle with a single idea long enough to transform it. Depth creates the space where original thinking can exist. What makes this difficult isn't lack of ability, but lack of protection. Attention is constantly auctioned off to the highest bidder, and without boundaries, it's easy to spend an entire day reacting instead of creating. Deep work flips that dynamic. It puts intention back in control of time. And slowly something else changes. Work stops following you everywhere. When focus has a home, rest becomes real. Even leisure feels richer because the mind isn't haunted by unfinished thoughts or half-formed ideas. Depth doesn't just improve work, it restores balance. In the end, deep work isn't about doing more. It's about doing what matters fully. In a world that constantly asks for attention, choosing where it goes becomes an act of ownership. And that choice, repeated over time, shapes not just the work that gets done, but the kind of life that gets built. That kind of life doesn't arrive suddenly. It's built in quiet increments, through decisions that feel almost invisible in the moment. Choosing depth rarely feels urgent, which is why it's so easy to postpone. But over time, those postponed moments stack up and the cost becomes clear, not in missed tasks, but in missed potential. Deep work changes the relationship with time itself. Hours stop slipping away unnoticed. Instead of reacting to whatever demands attention next, the day begins to revolve around what deserves attention most. The clock doesn't speed up or slow down, but awareness sharpens, and with it comes a stronger sense of control. There's also a shift in identity that happens beneath the surface. When focus becomes a habit, work is no longer defined by how visible it is to others, but by how honest it feels internally. The satisfaction comes from completion, not applause, from knowing something was taken as far as it could go. This is where deep work quietly separates surface-level effort from real craftsmanship. Craftsmanship requires patience. It requires the willingness to sit with imperfection and refine it, instead of abandoning it for something easier. That patience can't exist in a fragmented mind. Depth makes it possible. The irony is that deep work often creates more freedom, not less. By producing higher quality results in less distracted time, the mind earns rest without guilt. Even moments of stillness feel earned rather than wasted. The constant mental hum begins to fade. Over time, this way of working reshapes ambition. Goals become clearer, not bigger. Energy is spent more deliberately. There's less chasing, less comparison, less noise. What remains is a steadier, more grounded sense of progress. And that may be the most important takeaway of all. Deep work isn't about isolating yourself from the world or rejecting modern life. It's about reclaiming the ability to give your full attention to what truly matters. In a culture that pulls attention in every direction, depth becomes a form of quiet resistance and a path back to meaningful work. That path doesn't demand perfection. It asks for commitment, not once but repeatedly. Some days focus will come easily. Other days it will feel heavy and slow. But deep work was never about comfort. It was about choosing substance over stimulation, even when the difference isn't immediately visible. What makes this choice powerful is how ordinary it looks from the outside. No dramatic gestures, no constant updates, just quiet consistency. And yet, over time, that consistency compounds into something unmistakable. Work gains depth, thinking gains clarity, confidence grows from knowing that attention is no longer being scattered at random. Eventually, the results speak without needing explanation. Ideas sharpen, output improves, opportunities follow not because of louder effort but because of better work. In a world full of signals competing for notice, depth creates something rare, work that holds attention instead of begging for it. And perhaps the greatest shift happens internally. When focus is reclaimed, the mind feels less fractured. There's more presence, more intention, more space to think clearly. The constant sense of rushing fades, replaced by a quieter rhythm that feels sustainable. That is where this story ends, not with a rule or a checklist, but with a realization. The quality of attention shapes the quality of everything it touches. And when attention is given fully, even for a few protected hours, work stops being something that drains energy and becomes something that builds it. And once attention is reclaimed, something unexpected happens. Work starts to feel personal again. Not emotional, not dramatic, but personal in the sense that effort finally connects to outcome. When focus is fractured, it's hard to feel ownership over anything. Tasks blur together. Wins feel accidental. Losses feel vague. Depth restores that connection. You can trace results back to moments of real engagement. This is why shallow effort often leads to quiet frustration. Not because the work is unimportant, but because the mind never fully enters it. Without immersion, even good tasks feel incomplete. They hover in the background, unfinished not in status but in satisfaction. Deep work closes that gap. It gives work a beginning, a middle, and an end. There's also a psychological cost to constant distraction that often goes unnoticed. Every interruption resets thought. Every context switch drains a small amount of mental energy. Over time, the mind becomes tired without knowing why. Deep work reverses that fatigue by reducing friction. When attention stays in one place, energy is spent building instead of restarting. This is especially important in creative and intellectual work, where the best ideas rarely appear on command. They emerge slowly, after the obvious answers are exhausted. That process requires staying with uncertainty longer than most environments allow. Depth creates room for ideas to mature instead of being abandoned too early. And yet many people associate deep focus with isolation or rigidity. In reality, it creates more flexibility, not less. When the most demanding work is handled with full attention, the rest of the day opens up. Decisions become lighter. Interruptions feel less threatening. Time feels owned rather than borrowed. Over weeks and months, this approach reshapes self-trust. Promises made internally begin to matter again. Starting something no longer carries the quiet doubt of whether it will be finished properly. That trust compounds. Confidence grows not from motivation, but from consistency. This is why deep work has nothing to do with intensity for its own sake. It's not about grinding or forcing productivity. It's about alignment between effort and intention, between time spent and value created. When those align, work stops competing with life and starts supporting it. There's also a cultural shift happening beneath all of this. As noise increases, clarity becomes rarer. As information multiplies, meaning becomes harder to extract. Deep work isn't just a response to distraction, it's a response to overload. It's how a signal survives in an environment designed for volume. And perhaps the most overlooked benefit of depth is how it sharpens judgment. When the mind isn't constantly pulled outward, it becomes easier to tell what matters and what doesn't. Priorities stop being theoretical. They felt. Attention reveals value. That's why deep work isn't something to wait for when conditions are perfect. Perfect conditions never arrive. Depth is practiced inside imperfect days, inside limited time, inside noisy environments. It grows slowly, through repetition, not resolution. Eventually, the question shifts. It's no longer about how to protect focus, but about how anything meaningful ever happens without it. Deep work stops feeling like a technique and starts feeling like the default state where real thinking lives. And when that realization settles in, something quiet but powerful follows. Work stops feeling endless. Effort gains direction. Days regain shape. Not because everything is optimized, but because attention is finally invested instead of spent. That is the deeper promise behind this idea. Not just better output, but a better relationship with work itself. One rooted in presence, intention, and depth. In a world that constantly pulls attention outward, choosing to focus inward, even briefly, becomes an act that changes everything. What makes deep work difficult isn't that it's complex, but that it asks for something most modern systems quietly discourage: patience. Patience with slow progress, patience with confusion, patience with ideas that don't immediately resolve themselves. Distraction offers relief from that discomfort. Focus asks you to sit inside it, and yet it's inside that discomfort that real understanding forms. There's a reason why the most meaningful work often feels slow at first. The mind needs time to map the terrain of a problem, to understand its shape, its limits, and its hidden pathways. Quick engagement only scratches the surface. Depth allows the mind to descend, layer by layer, until insight replaces effort. That descent can't be rushed, and it can't be multitasked. This is also why deep work produces a different kind of satisfaction. It isn't the short-lived relief of checking something off a list. It's the heavier, quieter satisfaction of knowing something difficult was carried to completion. That feeling doesn't demand celebration. It lingers on its own, reinforcing the value of focus without needing external reward. Over time, the brain adapts to whatever it practices most. When distraction is constant, the brain becomes excellent at scanning, switching, and skimming. When depth is practiced, the brain becomes better at sustaining attention, holding complexity, and resisting impulse. Neither state is accidental. Each is trained moment by moment through repeated behavior. This means deep work isn't just a way of working, it's a way of thinking. It changes how problems are approached. Instead of looking for the fastest exit, the mind learns to stay. Instead of chasing novelty, it learns to extract meaning. That shift quietly alters the quality of decisions, conversations, and creative output. Another overlooked aspect of deep work is how it reframes difficulty. When attention is fragmented, difficulty feels threatening. It signals friction, resistance, and something to escape. But in a focused state, difficulty becomes information. It points toward growth, toward learning, toward areas that deserve more attention rather than less. This is why depth often leads to mastery, not because it accelerates everything, but because it allows the mind to revisit the same challenge from multiple angles. Each session adds another layer of understanding. Over time, what once felt overwhelming becomes intuitive. Complexity turns into clarity. There's also an emotional steadiness that comes from this process. Constant distraction creates constant stimulation, and constant stimulation creates emotional volatility. Focus, by contrast, stabilizes attention. It narrows the emotional range of the day, reducing anxiety and restlessness. The mind becomes quieter, not empty, but intentional. As that quiet grows, creativity changes too. Ideas stop competing for attention and start connecting. Instead of isolated thoughts, patterns begin to form. This is where originality comes from, not from more input, but from deeper processing. Depth gives ideas the time they need to interact. And perhaps most importantly, deep work restores a sense of agency. When attention is constantly pulled, life feels reactive. When attention is chosen, life feels directed. Even small acts of focus reinforce the belief that time can be shaped, not just spent. That belief matters. It influences ambition, confidence, and long-term vision. When people feel in control of their attention, they're more willing to pursue meaningful goals, the kind that require sustained effort over time. Depth makes long horizons feel possible again. In the end, deep work isn't about resisting the modern world. It's about learning how to move through it without being consumed by it. It's about recognizing that attention is finite, valuable, and worth protecting. And once that recognition settles in, focus stops being a struggle and starts becoming a choice, one that quietly defines the quality of work, thought, and life itself.